Good afternoon. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online. Happy Veterans Day. It is Wednesday, November 11th, 2020. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Thank you for joining us again this week for another episode of Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We try to be here every Wednesday, every week at 12 noon Eastern Time, and we're back with another great panel for this discussion about broadband and the Biden administration. We have been doing a great series of programs this fall, both on 5G. We have a series called A No-Nonsense Guide to 5G, which will be our subject next week, November 18th. And that series is sponsored by Samsung Electronics America. And we have another series on tools for broadband, which is focused on the kinds of software and deployment tools that fiber builders need to take the next step, particularly on rural broadband deployments. And that series is sponsored by Render Networks and Adtran. We're grateful for those sponsors. For this event today, Broadband and the Biden administration, we're sponsored by Broadband Now, the data source and data site that collects and publishes information about broadband availability, and very excited to be partnering with them, as well as the other organizations that I mentioned. Without any further ado, let me go ahead and turn to our guests for today's Broadband Breakfast Live Online. They are Scott Walston. Scott is the, I guess it's not just president, but senior fellow at the Technology Policy Institute. And we're also joined by Mark Jameson, who is the director and Gunter professor at the University of Florida and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. And their bios are listed on the page at Broadband Breakfast. You can see a fuller list of their backgrounds and credentials. Most notably in both of these, in both Scott and Mark's case, they were involved in transition teams for the Trump administration, and the Obama administration in the case of Scott. Let's start with you, Mark. You were on the Trump administration's FCC transition team. What is a transition team and what was it like to be involved in one, Mark?
So you can think of trying to take over an organization that has a $4 trillion budget and a few million employees, and you have, basically 10 weeks to do that. That is really hard to do. And so you need to have a team come in and help that transition happen. And that's basically what a transition team does. A transition team figures out what is going on in the different agencies and then tries to line up what the candidate, the president-elect and that administration will want to do in those particular agencies. So it's a lot of fact-finding, a lot of interviewing people, trying to understand the reality on the ground, and then what might be the different steps that a new administration might take to pursue its own policies. That's what a transition team looks like. And I guess I should also say there are basically three phases of it. There is a pre-election phase where people are getting together and planning the transition. Then there's the transition itself. And then once the transition has happened, there are also sometimes, I wasn't part of any of this, people that are put in the agencies temporarily just to be a resource for some of the new people that have been appointed as leads.
Well, very useful. So before we turn to Scott, let me ask two more questions, Mark. One is about the issue that kind of is on lots of people's minds today, just this Trump's refusal to concede, refusal to issue any congratulations to President-elect Biden, and sort of the continuing controversy because of that. How do you think that might play out in terms of a transition in the area we're speaking about here today, broadband and telecommunications?
Okay. I don't know how that will play out. Certainly the president is within his rights, wanting to make sure that everything was done correctly in the voting, and that makes perfectly good sense. We've been through things similar to this before. In 2000, it took a long time for the transition team to really kick in. So I suspect that if members of the Biden transition team show up at the FCC, that people work with them in a cooperative manner, just understanding that, at least for some people, there's a belief that the transition might be actually for the next Trump presidency. We'll see how that turns out.
So the other piece I wanted to ask about is, there obviously is a large-scale transition effort that that kind of Office of Personnel Management and other agencies are involved in that precedes the election. This kind of ties into what you said, the pre-election phase, the transition itself, and a post-inauguration phase. But what additional wrinkles are in play when you've got a independent, in quotes, agency like the FCC? I mean, obviously the chairman is picked by the president, but technically speaking, it is independent of the executive branch. So does that present any additional wrinkles in the transition aspects of Federal Communications Commission?
It certainly does. So one thing that particular part of the transition team might need to explain to the larger transition team is it's an independent agency. The president can say anything he or she might want to say, but you still have to get at the FCC a majority of votes. Some of those votes will be, in this case, Republicans. And so there's that issue that you just can't simply carry out an agenda. But then also you have some people who have been in some Democrat seats for a few years now. And so you actually have a pool of talent that you'll be tapping into. Whether any of the existing commissioners may be named chairman is a whole nother matter, but there's certainly a resource for the new administration.
Well, later in our program, I expect we'll get into some of the unusual circumstances of a departure of a Republican FCC commissioner, Mike O'Reilly, kind of late in the administration, and the nomination hearing or confirmation hearing yesterday for Nate Symington, which we covered at broadbandbreakfast.com. But for now, I just want to point out that previous Republican presidents have selected as chairman of the FCC a commissioner, sitting commissioner, avoiding a Senate confirmation process for them, whereas previous Democratic presidents have actually picked someone outside the agency in, I think, all cases, which is odd, in my opinion, but maybe it is or isn't a factor in play here. Scott, let's turn to you, and again, it may have been for a non-telecom agency, but just tell us a minute or two about your experience on a transition team, and then if that could move into the National Broadband Plan, which, like I said earlier, kind of operated as if it were a sort of transition team. Do you agree?
Right. Well, thanks, Drew. Thanks for having me this morning. So I was on a transition team for the National Credit Union Administration for the Obama transition. And right, it had nothing to do with telecom. But the point of the transition was pretty much what Mark said. I don't think it differs a lot by party. It was to prepare an incoming administration for what it needs to know with respect to everything. And so I was working with Greg Roston and Debbie Matz on this sort of relatively small agency. It's the NCUA, the FDIC for credit unions. And the idea was to prepare the incoming administration for what they were going to need to know on day one when they start. What are the issues coming up within the first month, and what are the issues that they sort of have to think about in the longer term from 6 months on. And so that way everyone sort of hits the ground running, knowing what it is that what they need to concentrate on. And so it wasn't to provide policy recommendations necessarily. It was really to give people, whoever it was going to be, the right background necessary to not have to waste time getting up to speed. And so it really was for us. It was like drinking water through a fire hose to learn everything about this administration and credit unions and how they all worked. Normally when people are on a transition team, you start with the advantage of knowing a lot about the industry or the agency that you're working on. But still, I think it's important for people to try to put aside their own particular their own particular biases, I guess, in order to prepare whoever it's going to be coming into what it is they're going to have to do. And when I say putting aside their biases, I mean recognizing that new administrations have people coming in with particular points of view, and that's why they're coming in too. So you want to take all that into account. But it's really supposed to be an objective approach to making the new administration, making the new folks in these agencies work smoothly with the people who are already there, and allowing the agencies to continue their work without interruption.
So talk about the National Broadband Plan and how that was or wasn't like a transition team, so to speak.
Right. So the National Broadband Plan, which Blair Levin ran, as everyone knows. So it was similar in that it was trying to come up with a map for how for what broadband policy should look like or could look like going forward. What are the things that that the team thought needed to be done, and how it was possible to get there. And so the hope was then that the FCC and other agencies that were mentioned would take advantage of this plan and try to work forward to meet its goals. So it was similar in that it was supposed to try to set up a plan for identifying what are the problems now, what are the problems going forward, where would we like to get to, and in that sense it was similar, although we had a lot longer. I mean, I think it was a pretty good accomplishment to do a project of that magnitude in the amount of time we had, but it was still a lot longer than a transition team has, which is just from the election until inauguration day. Hopefully from the election, as we've seen, there are some delays now in starting it.
Well, the other thing we haven't yet mentioned, of course, is that we continue to be in the middle of a global pandemic, right? I mean, we kicked off this series, Broadband Breakfast Live Online, in March as the pandemic was becoming sort of apparent to everyone. And the role that broadband plays in facilitating connectivity, indeed, interactions, how does that impact a transition team? And again, this is maybe the last question before we move to the substance of what kinds of recommendations the telecom or FCC transition team will consider. What is that? What are the obstacles to meeting, quote unquote, when the FCC is not, to my knowledge, in the building yet?
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, I think like with a lot of things, it has advantages and disadvantages. When you're doing something like this, you want to meet as many people as possible to try to learn as many facets as possible. And it's harder to do that now. You can't just sit down with somebody easily over a cup of coffee, or you can't spread out all the documents in front of you and go over them together and have everybody explain. But on the other hand, it's easier to meet with people from all over the country and all over the world, and that was was much harder before. Maybe in principle now we could do both if the pandemic were over, but there are advantages and disadvantages as we've seen with lots of things that we do.
Yeah,
Mark,
my work.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, my work on the transition team was largely remote anyway, because I live in Florida. I wasn't funded at all, so any of my travel to DC was on my dime anyway. So I did almost all of my work remotely. We had a few days of meetings with people at the FCC, but we found that we could do a lot of it from different places that we were, because the three primary people were Jeff Eisenach, Rosalind Layton, and myself. Jeff was the only one with easy access to DC. Rosalind and I were always someplace else in the world.
So I can't resist, Mark. What were the goals of the transition team that have actually been implemented? Because again, we want to understand how these recommendations translate into policy. We're going to talk here now about broadband infrastructure and stimulus and broadband adoption. But what were the problems apparent to you that the three of you wanted to tackle, and how have they been implemented by the FCC?
Right. So one thing that maybe sounds a little strange is that in being part of the transition team, I signed a non-disclosure agreement that kind of binds me forever from giving out any details on the inside, even though GSA, as I recall, dumped all that data out onto the public just a few days after the inauguration. But I still signed it, and I'll keep to it. One thing that actually made it easy for us was that we had two really solid sitting commissioners that already had clear ideas about where the FCC should go and what the regulation should or should not look like, what the policy should or should not look like. And the Trump campaign had said almost nothing about any issues related to telecommunications or technology. So we had a fairly clean slate and could simply allow the agency to be able to, the commissioners to pursue, once the inauguration was done, pursue the ideas that seemed logical to them. So without disclosing too much, it really wasn't too hard.
You know, I think one of the advantages, at least when I was doing it, was that the outgoing administration was very cooperative, and people were willing to help. And I think the obstacles that we're seeing so far are just awful, and are not going to be helpful at all. I mean, we know that in Bush v. Gore, they weren't able to start the transition until December. But it's not just wasted time now. It's an attitude. The president clearly does not want to start a transition, and it's appalling. It's abhorrent.
Well, and obviously a lot of people may be feeling that right now, Scott. But does that really have a bearing on telecom, on the FCC, where we have the exact situation Mark just mentioned? Two commissioners of the FCC, Jessica Rosenworcel, Jeffrey Starks, Democrats. They can presumably, turn on a dime and do the things that President Biden wants, just as Ajit Pai and Mike O'Reilly were able to do the same in the Trump administration.
Well, that's true. That's a good point. Also, we've seen no evidence that Commissioner Pai would want to make it difficult either. I mean, I'm sure he'll be totally cooperative as well. And same with the FTC. And I think that's definitely an advantage of these being independent agencies, because so far we've seen no evidence at all of any problems with the transition from either of those agencies.
Well, in the description for this event, I did highlight the phrase from the Build Back Better website of the Biden-Harris transition team that says, mobilize American ingenuity to build a modern infrastructure and an equitable clean energy future. And then it specifically references roads and bridges, energy grids and schools, universal broadband. So universal broadband, what does that word universal as a qualifier mean to you, Scott and Mark? And what does that portend in terms of policy from the FCC?
It's a universal broadband or universal telecommunications service has been a phrase for a long time. And, of course, universal service originally meant universal service provided universally by AT&T as the monopolist. And it was AT&T's argument, was Ma Bell's argument for why they should be the only provider ever to provide service. But now, of course, it has a different meaning, and the idea is that everyone should have access to broadband. But we still don't have a solid definition of what that means, because even with just regular landline telephones, I don't think we ever got above like 96% penetration of that. But I think we generally considered that we had universal telephone coverage. So I don't think we have a strong definition of it. But generally, it means that people should have the ability to everyone should have the ability to participate in society to the extent that that broadband makes it necessary. And during the pandemic, we've seen how important that is.
Yeah, I agree. That's basically the idea behind universal service. Is we just try to remove as many barriers as we can. We don't have a specific metric. We just do the very best that we can. And I think that the different administrations over time have done a fairly good job of focusing on it that way. Now, as Scott knows, because he and I have been in telecoms for a long time, we had some fairly disastrous universal service policies for, oh gosh, I don't know how long, maybe 30 years or so, where we just simply sent telecom companies money and said, please do good things with it. And sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't.
Sometimes we didn't even say that to them.
That's true. I was being perhaps too generous. But now, thanks in part to Scott and some of his research he's done, the Obama administration started it. We started a competitive process. If you want money to subsidize something, you have to compete for that, just like you'd have to compete for a customer. And that has worked really well. I think the FCC under Ajit Pai has done a really good job of advancing that. And I expect, without any inside knowledge, of course, that the Biden administration will embrace that and continue with it, because there's just a lot of satisfaction with how that has gone.
So you're talking, of course, about the reverse auction process that was in place for the Connect America Fund Round 2 and for the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund Round 1 that's going on right now. I will flag one issue that was kind of controversial in the lead up to RDOF, and that is that the FCC acknowledgingly was using inadequate maps that overstated coverage. And the argument of the Democrats on the FCC was we should wait until the mapping process, improving the maps, is complete. Ajit Pai said, no, we want to go forward with round one. We'll fix it. And for round two, I wonder what both of your thoughts are on the broadband mapping question and how that will play into universal broadband.
Yeah, I guess I'll start. So, I mean, I love data. In fact, Drew, that's I think where we first met many years ago. Exactly, that's right. We did an event, a joint event on data, broadband data, and so it's, you know, getting better data is important, and there's a lot of work being done on that. But I don't see that as a reason to delay the RDOF. It should have been a reason to delay the RDOF auction, in part because there's a challenge process. And so it was sort of a long process of identifying the areas that were up for, that were going to be up for bid. And so anybody who wanted to could contest an area and say, look, we're providing service here, and they would have to demonstrate it. And so, you know, through those challenge processes, we were able to sort of develop a better understanding of those particular areas. And you know, and we don't know how much better new data will be in those, you know, in specific places. So, you know, you could delay forever until you get better and better data. And the data that we'll be collecting next will be better than the data we have now, and it will still have problems because it's a difficult process. I think we have a fundamental problem with our data collection, which is that it's left over from the 19th century, basically. That the U.S. Census first did they called it a census of telephones. They counted every single line, so it was a census, it was a count, and you know, we still kind of do that with our adoption and availability numbers. And you know, we need to be doing things more like surveys, like the BLS does and the BEA does. And you know, I think so we kind of need to be fundamentally rethinking a lot of this. And I don't know that what we're doing now, it's not clear that the RDOF would yield a better result if we waited for new data to come in, although I am looking forward to that new data.
Mark, what are your thoughts on the broadband data question, how that factors into universal broadband?
Yeah, I think I would have handled it basically the same way that Chairman Pai did. It would be nice for the commission to have all the great data in its hands, but there's our systems for getting people to tell you what they know, and Scott described those quite well. So I would have moved forward as well, because there are people who could benefit from the auction, and it was time to move on with that.
Well, okay, so you would have done that, but now that we're here, what do you do now? What would if each of you were on the Biden transition team for, you know, this incoming administration, what would you suggest they do about broadband data mapping or other kind of tools, if you will, to inform the policies?
So Scott, I'll let you go ahead. I've got to step away for just a minute. My apologies. I'll be
sure.
right back.
Yeah, no, I have a lot of thoughts on this. So first, there are things that we are not doing that we should be doing, and that still haven't come up in the questions of data, and that's particularly with respect to adoption by low-income people. The RDOF and all of that, that's mostly talking about rural coverage, which is important, but we spend far more money on rural areas than we do on low-income people, and we should be focusing more on low-income people. And our data collection efforts there are not good at all. The best information we have is from the American Community Survey from the U.S. Census, and it's good. It provides us good data on the share of people who do not have broadband. But what we don't know very much about what works and what doesn't in terms of getting people online. And we need to know a lot more about it. And right now, schools all around the country, thousands and thousands of school districts are trying best they can to solve a digital divide problem in real time. And so here in Montgomery County, Maryland, where I live, the school district has given out hotspots to any kid who needs one, and Chromebooks too. You know, is that a solution? I don't know, maybe. And the point is, maybe. We've got thousands of school districts all trying different things. We have experiments going on right now. We should be collecting data on this. Somebody should be collecting data. What is every school doing? and then follow up. Well did it work? How many people ended up connected? For how many people did the plan not work? And then we can look at outcomes a little bit later. Given the amounts of money that we're talking about to deal with this digital divide problem, we're talking about giving out billions and billions of dollars. Studying this is the tiniest fraction of what we're talking about spending. Why nobody is collecting this data and studying it is beyond me. Not the FCC, not the education department. As far as I know, no foundation is studying it. There are people along, I think there are individuals in some small places trying to do it on a small scale. But we need to be doing it comprehensively and consistently so that we can learn something. I think it's just terrible that we're missing this opportunity. It's a real shame.
Well, we won't drop that thought. We'll come back to this. We want to encourage your questions and comments, and we've got one here from R.H. McLean. How can we influence the FCC agenda for the next 4 years? Kind of an interesting process question. Someone who wants to influence the policy right now. What is the way into that that process at this moment? I'll start with you, Mark.
So trying to influence the transition team is a little sketchy. We really restricted who we would speak with. We focused just on the FCC people we were working with from the Obama administration and people within the transition team themselves. Eventually, we would meet with some outsiders to listen, but we didn't really engage with them in any way to try and have them influence policy other than just simply we tried to learn as much as we could. So if I were thinking about, I'd really like to influence that FCC, I would think about maybe trying to get a position at it. If you want to shoot for a commissioner job, that's one thing. That's a very political process. But they will be looking for some professional people to help populate many of the offices. And it's a great opportunity to do some really substantive work. I train utility regulators all over the world, and I always tell them, when you step into that regulatory arena, it's like drinking from a fire hose. The amount of information you have coming at you, the magnitude of the decisions you have to make is in part overwhelming, but it's really more exhilarating than anything else. And you can have a great deal of influence just by being somebody who's smart and informed and engaged. Other than that, get to know the people who are involved there and spend some time with them.
Well, I want to get Scott's take on this. I can't resist. I've listened to this podcast years ago called Presidential that the Washington Post has done on every president. And just a few days ago, they did an updated version on Joe Biden, which was nice to hear, kind of a historical take. And in this podcast, the presenter, Lillian Cunningham, always really gets at kind of common themes. And one theme that's emerged over and over again is kind of the job seeking. I mean, this was a very central issue in American politics in the 19th century, the spoil system, right? And that is to say, a new administration comes in, new jobs, right? So that's kind of an interesting take that you just provided, Mark. And I wonder, Scott, what's your reaction to that and your thought on influencing the FCC and the FCC transition team?
Right. Well, first of all, let me just follow up a little bit on what Mark said. Just people trying to get involved. I mean, these are also sort of long-term things, and so to the extent that there are some great regulators around the world, that has a lot to do with Mark actually in running his center and training these regulators around the world, and that's been going on for a long time and has made a huge difference. So it's not something that happens quickly or easily, and so I think the point of sort of getting involved and working on it hard, you can't understate the importance of that because things take time. And also, if people who are interested in working in regulatory staff, I think the FCC gets a lot of criticism for the data problems and so on, but the staff knows all of this. They know these data better than anyone else. They know all of the problems. They probably know how to fix them. They're not allowed to or given the resources to. So yeah, those are smart people who know what they're doing. And people should work on learning what they trying to learn what they know. So in terms of job seeking, that's part of every transition and administration. Everybody wants a job. And it's not just that everybody wants a job, it's that everybody thinks that they have the solution to whatever the problem is. And now it's their turn. They're gonna implement what they think is the right answer, whether the data supports it or not. And that's something I wish were different.
That's where Scott comes in. Data. No, I mean,
right.
Mark, can you say a word or two about it? I apologize for not being as familiar with your center. I guess it's called the Public Utility Research Center at the University of Florence. And just take a minute or two and tell us what you do.
Yeah, certainly. So I joined the center in 1996, and I joined very specifically because the center was transitioning from being something that was kind of Florida-centric to going international. The World Bank had contacted the director of the center and said, we need utility regulators trained. Could you step up and do this? We'll give you a little bit of seed money, but it's up to you from there. And we have trained thousands of people all over the world where we're able to do it without subsidies from someone. We have trained people from 160 countries, I believe it is now. In fact, I started my morning this morning doing an online course for the telecommunications regulator in Saudi Arabia. Since the pandemic, we've done training in the Caribbean as well, but again, it's all done remotely. But we've worked with a lot of people, and it's
no trips to the Caribbean for you.
Yeah, not right now. They're doing it all by themselves, but it's very satisfying to see how hard people work to try and understand these issues and deal with the complexities. And it reminds me when I started in this business. It's exhilarating, and I'm really, really happy with the work they're all doing.
Well, we'll have to put a link to the page here after this event ends, Mark. Let me not let up on this key point I want to get at, which is to say, how will the FCC under a Biden administration approach broadband infrastructure and broadband adoption use? One of the kind of key innovations that I felt from the National Broadband Plan under Blair Levin was the three-part structure where it talked about the infrastructure, but also the national purposes, it was called. And it talked about things like education, healthcare, civic engagement, even transportation. The way broadband is a pervasive issue that intersects so many aspects of public policy and indeed in our lives is what to me makes the issue and the subject so fascinating. So I'm wondering if both of you could tackle both of these questions. What do you expect out of a Biden administration when it comes to a stimulus, whether it's framed as a COVID stimulus or just an infrastructure bill, to deal with broadband, to invest billions of dollars in broadband? What do you make of that? And secondly, what do you see the Biden administration doing to tackle the adoption use? Scott, you made reference to this a little bit earlier on. This is a key issue. This is kind of where the pandemic is really hitting and hurting. So I'd really like both of your thoughts on these two separate issues.
Right. Well, so first on the infrastructure part, I want to emphasize what Mark said about the competitive bidding, the reverse auctions. That's been really a bipartisan success. It was started under, I believe, Janikowski, and then Tom Wheeler continued, and Ajit Pai has continued it, including the auction that's happening right now. And it works extremely well, and hopefully more and more of the money spent in rural areas will be allocated that way, rather than sort of it's still just kind of incremental amounts. So that's going to be important, and hopefully any new infrastructure bill that's trying to fund rural areas would continue that. I also hope that there is there needs to be a lot of transparency in how the money is distributed and where it's given out. We always talk about the FCC, the Universal Service Fund, but the Rural Utilities Service also spends a lot of money, and how they do it and where they spend it and what happens with it is extremely opaque. And the GAO says that again and again and again. And so it'd be nice if we see some transparency there. Now on adoption, again, I think there is part of the problem is we don't know exactly how to get the last group of people online, and as time progresses, it gets harder and harder because it's a smaller and smaller group, and so you're trying to reach the more people who are more and more difficult to reach. So it's not surprising that it gets harder over time, and that's nobody's failure or fault. But there's a belief that if all you do is lower the price, that'll take care of the problem. And even though in surveys people do list cost as one of the 2 or 3 reasons that they don't subscribe, and as an economist, I believe in downward sloping demand curves. If you make something cheaper, more people will take it. But we found that you can put the price almost to zero, and a lot of people still won't subscribe. We saw that in experiments that the FCC did in 2013. We see that with programs like Comcast's Internet Essentials, which is for a private program, very successful. Greg Roston and I did a study of that and found it had some pretty big effects on the margins. And so as a company, they should consider it, they should be proud of it. But you still find lots of families, lots of households in Comcast territory who still don't subscribe. And when Internet Essentials is $9.90 or $10 a month, and Lifeline is basically $10 a month subsidy, you in effect have a lot of households who are not subscribing at $0 a month. So that's not the only problem. And so I think we really need more study on why certain households and some people don't subscribe, so that we can.
Is it really more study, Scott, or is it just getting that subsidy and Internet Essentials or whoever link up, right? Because I'm sure there's bureaucratic hoops to go through to get the subsidy and also to get the Internet Essentials, right?
Well, there certainly could be issues with how difficult it is to get on Lifeline. We know that there are different take rates across states, given how the different states manage it, and so that could certainly be an issue. But it was the same thing with these FCC experiments. It was really hard to get people to sign up, and they built these really nice experiments that were with control groups and so on across wireline and wireless with several different companies. They had 14 different experiments in total. And they had lots of hypotheses they were testing, and they really weren't able to actually test any of their hypotheses because the biggest result was that they only got about 10% of the sign up that they expected. And so that, in fact, is an incredibly important result because it showed that we just didn't quite understand what we're missing. And people who just want to spend more on Lifeline without looking into that, I think are raising the risk that we won't get the kind of bang for the buck that we want. And so, study doesn't necessarily mean waiting and doing nothing. You can try lots of different experiments. You could try something different in every state, for example. And we could try to learn something what works. So study is not an excuse for doing nothing. It's recognizing that we don't know as much as we think we do.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is build into the systems, the subsidies, a system for studying it, so that the next time we do this, the next administration will be able to take advantage of that new knowledge, right?
And one other thing quickly, you talked about the uses, and that was part of the National Broadband Plan, and yeah, ultimately we care about how broadband is used. We don't, if people can get the same use of it from, any technology, we just don't care what technology it is. The point is the connection and what people do with it, what people do with it. So one thing we need to think about is what types of barriers are there that we can remove, and we saw that with the pandemic. Very quickly, we removed barriers to telemedicine. For example, regulatory barriers that made it that prevented doctors from being reimbursed at full rates for a telehealth visit, that prevented therapists from seeing patients across state lines. We took all of those down because it was important, and people use those now. And once the pandemic is over, people will certainly want to go back to their doctor's offices and see therapists in person and so on. But many will, but there will still be a huge demand for these teleservices. And we found that there are these regulatory barriers blocking them. And one thing we can do to encourage use is to find as many of those as possible and get rid of them.
Well, interesting take, Mark. What's your response to both the infrastructure question and the adoption and use question?
Scott is a very data-driven and research-driven guy, and so am I. So we have a lot of agreement here. I would be very skeptical of stimulus money going out through the Department of Commerce, going through the Department of Agriculture. The FCC has by far the best system for distributing these subsidies where they're needed and where they're valued, and the best systems of control. So I would hope that if there's going to be any taxpayer money put into it, that is where it would go, is through the FCC. The attempts before to run it through the more political parts of government have resulted, as you might think, the money went to people that were politically connected, and we didn't get much broadband.
How do we know that, Mark? Because I mean, just to push back a little bit again, I may not be up to speed on the most data research, but from the perspective of being on the ground and working with a lot of the entities, the stimulus package under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act really assisted in middle mile competition that didn't exist before. So I mean, again, we don't necessarily have the data at our fingertips, or I certainly don't. What is the basis for your saying that it wasn't, quote, done well or wasn't the best way?
Some statistical research and some casual empiricism, my experience. So middle mile. I spent some time talking with one of the entities in Florida that received middle mile subsidies. And they were very proud of themselves that they were going to use that money to compete with Verizon. They said, yeah, we'll put some fiber over here because we've got to do that, but there's no money over there. We can't pay for anything. So we're going to go compete with Verizon. They were very proud of that. A couple years later, they folded up and didn't have hardly any customers at all. And there's stories like that. And then I know there's been at least 2 studies looking at the impacts. One study looked at where did the money go? So under the stimulus package, it was supposed to go to poor areas, rural areas, minority groups, etc. And when you run the numbers, the best explanatory variables of who got money was, did you have a Democrat governor? Did you have a congressman of either party that sat on a powerful committee? And that explained almost everything except American Indian got a little bit. Otherwise, nothing else seemed to matter. And then there's also studies of, okay, this money was spent, you look in the areas, can we notice a bump in the amount of broadband? And we couldn't find it. So it just doesn't work anywhere near as well as what the FCC does. So you really want to run it through those kind of competitive processes if you can. Go ahead.
Sorry. What about the stimulus package actually paying for people's broadband for a period of time? Do you view that as a palatable approach because of the increasing importance of broadband in the course of the pandemic?
Well, I'd run it through the FCC. Use the competitive process. I am fine because we don't have a cost-benefit analysis of how much should we subsidize broadband. I'm fine with running more into the system, but I'd run it through the FCC rather than take it through a process where, I don't know how it might be done. And then you also have to worry about when you have multiple systems that you have duplication. So we indeed ran into that with the money under the stimulus package, that there was money being spent on broadband where you already had some other subsidies going. And so I've talked with a lot of people, the state level, et cetera, of rather than having your own subsidy for broadband, you may be duplicating subsidies the FCC is already providing. Why not partner with the FCC and say, we'd like to have more broadband in Florida, we'd like to have more broadband in Alabama, or wherever that might be. Partner with them, provide some additional funding, and then you will get more subsidies flowing. But it's all in one system, as opposed to allowing companies to double dip.
Well, some real strong votes of support for the FCC from both of you. Let's use the last 15 minutes or so to talk about a few other issues. One of which, a very hot issue on the Washington regulatory side, is net neutrality, right? And the common wisdom has been that this is an issue on which the incoming Biden administration is in sync with a lot of the tech companies. There may be others that they're not in sync on, but one that they are is going back to the Obama administration approach to net neutrality, which put it as a Title II telecommunications service. Obviously, as most of our listeners will know, that was reversed by Chairman Ajit Pai in December 2017. There has not been effective net neutrality regulation for the past 3 years now. Mark, you had an article where you basically said you actually think Biden will not get rid of or not reinstate net neutrality. Could you give that argument, Mark, why you think that is so?
Well, I don't know that they might or might not try to reinstitute it. My argument was if they do, they'll simply show that it doesn't work very well. I think 5G is by far the best way to think about this. 5th generation wireless is the technology divides traffic into slices so it can be customized in the treatment. People get exactly the kinds of channels they want. So, today Facebook has all kinds of fiber optics out there. So does Google. Netflix is doing similar things. Any edge provider, these social media platform providers that has money are customizing their own internet. Everybody else has to be on this public internet that under net neutrality all looks the same. And so the small entrepreneurs don't get that customization. With 5G, you can get it, but you'd be violating net neutrality. So you can either have a very sophisticated 5G that's world-class, or you can have a dumb one that doesn't accomplish much more than we have today. And I think once people get a taste of that, they'll say, we'd really like greater value. We don't want this thing that's bland that we pretty much had before.
Well, 5G is still, an evolving process, right? There are obviously lots of gains and systems coming on board, including enterprise systems, which we'll be talking about soon on our no-nonsense guide to 5G. But it has to be fed by fiber, right? That's undergirding getting the transceivers into the neighborhoods. You need to build the fiber deeper into the neighborhoods. And so I guess my question for either of you, again, is there any grounds to think that net neutrality won't be the first political hot potato that the FCC has to consider?
Before I answer that, I just want to say one last thing about the adoption question. I think vouchers are probably the way to go when you're talking about individuals. And Lifeline is close to a voucher program, not quite. But paying directly for people's subscriptions at some higher price. I think the risk is if you were to give everybody, say, a $40 subsidy a month, then immediately the lowest price of a broadband plan will be $40 a month. Because why would anybody price it lower if you can get a check for $40 directly from the government to your company? If we think there's some network externalities and people aren't subscribing at the extent we think they should, make the vouchers refundable. Let people, if you get a $20 voucher and you can get a service for $10, let them keep the extra $10 a month. I'm not sure. There are ways other than just putting money in the ISP's pockets.
Okay. Thanks for that.
But now on net neutrality. We've seen that the horror stories that were predicted without net neutrality didn't happen. People have complaints about certain issues now, but the things that people predicted did not happen. On the other hand, when there was net neutrality, investment didn't collapse either. In some ways, this debate has taken on much more importance than perhaps it should. But I also think that if we do have net neutrality, if it does come back in a debate, and Tom Wheeler has said that that's one of the things that a Biden administration would do. Now, don't know whether that's just his preference or not. I think the debate will be different because one of the main tenets of net neutrality has been no paid prioritization. And now during the pandemic, we see why no paid prioritization may be a mistake. Why would you not want a higher quality, a guaranteed higher quality connection between kids and their schools? Why would you not want to be able to talk to your doctor with a guarantee that your connection is not going to drop off? I think people see the potential value in those things. And so the idea that just no pay prioritization is always the right answer, I don't think anyone's going to say that anymore. Some people will say that, sure. But I think the argument it's going to be hopefully a more subtle debate, nuanced debate, I guess I should say.
Well, that's not a bad lead into the issue I want to get both of your take on, which is this debate about Section 230. I know I teed up antitrust, privacy, which aren't natural issues for the FCC to tackle, although obviously antitrust figures into merger situations. But the Section 230 debate is now front and center before the FCC as a result of Chairman Pai's decision to accede to the proposal that the Trump administration Commerce Department put forward, and that was indeed an issue before the Commerce Committees considering Nate Symington. So, what are your thoughts on this Section 230 debate and how it will impact the FCC? Is it going to kind of go back and drop off with the Biden administration, or on the contrary, is it going to accelerate? Again, I'd love both of your thoughts on this, Scott and Mark.
Section 230 seems to be one thing that Trump and Biden agree on, probably for different reasons, and they're both wrong. I think. I don't think the FCC should have anything to do with anything that starts to look like censorship. To me, it's wrong. It's bad. And when the FCC starts to get into it, that's, in my opinion, that's an area it should never be in. Given that there's so much support for trying to change how platforms are how liable for the content, we're probably likely to see something. Hopefully not through the FCC, and hopefully we whatever it does still respects the First Amendment.
Mark?
So a lot of agreement with Scott again. But as I talk with regulators around the world and I ask them, those that regulate broadcasting, anything to do with content, I ask them, how does that influence or how does that affect your agency? They all tell me that all of the energy goes towards the political aspects of content. And if you want to suck the oxygen out of the FCC and all of the difficult work it does on spectrum and technology and such as that, just give it that responsibility. And that's exactly what will happen. So I do hope that if anything is done, it is not done through this kind of an agency. I'd prefer it be done someplace else. And I'm very skeptical of doing anything that gets the government in the role of saying, here's what's true, here's what's not, here what should be said, and here's what should not be said. I just don't think that's a good role for a political entity at all. What I would like to see is for something that makes it clear on the part of the platforms that they explain to their customers, here's what we really are going to do. And so, anytime I go on Twitter these days, if I see something from a conservative talking about the election, there's always a warning label on it. And you just get used to that. Maybe it'd be good if Twitter just admitted that we're skeptical of these kinds of views. And so the marketplace can decide. Maybe Twitter isn't the greatest place for those discussions. People are discovering it, but maybe it'd been good to have been more upfront. And I would like the platforms to talk with their customers and say, here's how we think. We're just skeptical of these kinds of perspectives. And so then customers can say, yeah, if I'm going to have that discussion, maybe I really want to have it someplace else.
So how do the tech platforms manage this? Let's just say, put yourself in those shoes. They've got the issue of, at least the biggest ones have the issue of antitrust. Lawsuits been filed against Google. Word is that there'll be another one this month against Facebook from the Federal Trade Commission. Amazon has just been sued in the European Union this week. What is the way they navigate this? I guess to kind of put a cap on the 230 issue. Yes, it's true that candidate Joe Biden did say he wanted Section 230 to be repealed, but he hasn't repeated that. And the two Democratic commissioners on the FCC have both been very much opposed to the FCC doing anything about it. So again, kind of maybe the point you're making is this is a job for Congress, right? And my argument for some time about net neutrality has been Congress really should deal with this issue of net neutrality, because my perception, Mark, is that it will be an issue for the FCC, net neutrality. And so you're constantly flipping administration to administration, which is testing the patience of our Chevron deference wearing hats, right? So I guess the point I'm trying to make for both of you, and I'd love your thoughts on this question, is the tech industry navigating the shoals of Section 230 of privacy, right? There's kind of, it's always a bubbling concern, but never seems to get done by Congress. And now into the mix, we have antitrust. And Mark, you've written about this, and you've been very skeptical of the Google antitrust lawsuit. I'm wondering if you could, let's start with you, Mark, on this one. Is what's the tech industry's reaction to Biden and Harris coming in as the new president and vice president?
Oh, wow, I have no inside information on how any of the companies think about the Biden administration coming in. One thing on net neutrality in Congress, though, I'm very skeptical of politics trying to dictate industry structure. That always ends poorly for us. The economics change, but the stakeholders interests don't. They get embedded in the legislation. So you have some archaic frameworks that eventually die off, but not without a lot of suffering along the way. I wonder, my guess is that we will continue to see antitrust actions against the big tech companies. Certainly the Democrats in Congress were very excited about it. Whether they'll remain excited, I don't know. That'll, I think, depend very much upon who's appointed to the Federal Trade Commission, who's appointed within the Department of Justice. That may drive it as much as anything. The White House itself may not get very involved, but I don't know. Not an insider on any of that.
Well, and this is kind of where a transition team matters, right? Because they're really putting in place people. People are becoming policy, right? And so who are the people that the transition team is? Does the transition team have much of involvement in that? I mean, Mark, were you involved in saying, hey, you want to get these people involved, or was it more about policy?
When in the Trump transition team, there was a separate group that was on personnel. We had no involvement with personnel at all.
Scott, how about you? What's your experience on that question?
Well, so first, with all these problems that the tech companies have to navigate, some are impossible. The content moderation problem it's an impossible one for them to solve, because if they take too much down, they get accused of censorship, which as private platforms, of course, they have every right to take down what they want. But if they don't take things down, then they're accused of promoting either misinformation or or other things that that are terrible. So you're either going to take down too much or you're going to take down too little. And because everyone's preferences are different, there's no right answer. And so they're going to be subject to this criticism and complaint forever, because there is no right answer. You can use algorithms to do it, but they're still going to make mistakes, and you have to decide, are you going to err on type 1 or type 2 error? You're going to move towards one of those, or you can have people do it, and it's a disaster for that too.
15 seconds, type 1. What's type 1? What's type 2?
Well, when you do something that shouldn't have, when you take down something that should have stayed up versus when you leave something up that should have been taken down, and there's no way to know what the right answer to that is, so they're stuck.
Well, so this is where we kind of come back to Mark, maybe not as directly said, well, the solution is competition. There needs to be a conservative alternative to Twitter, is kind of how I heard your statement there, Mark. I mean, is there competition, or are there structural problems keeping competitive rivals to Google and Facebook and Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Twitter? I mean, wherever you want to draw the line, right? I mean, are there systemic problems that we need to think about antitrust in a different way than the consumer welfare standard we've been thinking about it for 40 some years?
Well, that's two things within that. One, I'm very skeptical of trying to replace what we call the consumer welfare standard, which you might just simply say that the economy is about the consumers. And if we're going to regulate it, we're going to regulate it to the benefit of consumers. If you don't regulate it to the benefit of consumers, who are you regulating it for? Well, in the past, it was regulated for whoever was kind of popular at the moment. So you might get some big business that was politically connected, or a small business that was, and so antitrust might serve their interests somehow. That's not what we'd be interested in. We really want it to be for consumers. I think that standard is quite good. With respect to the dilemma that Scott was talking about, that the tech companies find themselves in, a conservative Twitter or whatever, I don't know if that's an answer. I do think that the companies actually compete quite a bit, because they're not necessarily competing for Scott's tweet or my tweet. What they're competing for is people's time and attention, so that they can then compete in basically the ad market. There should be some different business models that emerge down the road, but that's kind of where we are. And so Google, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, and a host of other people are all competing for those same things, but in very different ways. They differentiated their products, but they do compete with each other quite intensively.
Well, you both point out that you're not on a Biden transition team, so you maybe don't have any inside knowledge, nor are we pretending you do. But as a last word, could each of you say, what advice would you dispense to such a transition team? What would be your key point or two, Scott, and then Mark, that you would dispense to the Biden-Harris transition team working on the FCC/communications sector?
Evidence-based policy. First question for any proposal should be, where's the evidence?
Yeah, and I have to agree. Part of my studying in the transition teams, my own personal studying, is I interviewed a lot of people on past FCCs and asked the question, what were the highest and best times? And people pointed to the time when Reed Hundt was chairman and Michael Katz was the chief economist, because Hunt made sure every decision went through Michael to make sure that the economics was right. And I think that PI has tried to do something similar with forming this Office of Economics and Data Analytics. I think that's really solid. Stick with the evidence. That is by far the most important thing. And don't let go of some of the things that are going well, like how we are doing the reverse auctions and things like that.
Well, thank you very much, Scott Walston of Technology Policy Institute, Mark Jameson, University of Florida, and this your center there. Very much appreciate the time you've taken to be with us. And thank you, too, to all of you who have watched us, who have been with us here this week and every week. We'll be back next Wednesday, November 18th, with a session on a no-nonsense guide to 5G, a case study of transformative apps in the enterprise. I'm Drew Clark, Broadband Breakfast. Thanks for being with us here today.
Thank you.